wrapping up GalaxyCon with a little look back at 1982. For those of you who don't know, 1982 Greatest Geek Year Ever is a documentary we recently finished. It's we're going to be announcing how you can see it this summer. It's going to be you're going to be able you won't be able to miss it. So
please, if you have an empty seat next to you, raise your hand. Lots of people are coming in.
Yeah, it's,
thank you.
But we'll be announcing. I wish I could tell you right now, but the ink is drying. But it will be it'll be airing this summer, and so keep an eye on the 1982 movie social channels, which will announce when it's playing. But we did this film to honor what is one of the great movie years of all time, and probably one of the great times for popular culture. Time of the Atari 2600, the Intellivision. It was great music. There was a great television. Cheers premiered that year. St. Elsewhere premiered. Family Ties. But it was really the movies that make it pretty special. Obviously, you guessed already, we'll be talking about E.T., Blade Runner, Poltergeist,
Tron,
Dark Crystal, Fitzcarraldo. Okay, I'll skip over Fitzcarraldo. But
you don't skip over Fitzcarraldo. You just sort of
pull it up
over
the mountain. Yeah, exactly. Rocky III, 48 Hours. I mean, the list is staggering. How many Conan the Barbarian, the amazing films. And so in our documentary, which will air as a 4-part TV event, we deal with all those movies and more. And we brought with us a small clip from the Star Trek II section, because that seemed appropriate. Do you remember seeing Star Trek II for the first time in 1982, Darren?
I do. I remember seeing it. We went to the theater probably the week after it opened, because we were busy the first weekend. But, I had already been a big fan of Star Trek the Motion Picture, and didn't really know what to expect from this one. And when the new music came up and the new title, it looked fun to me. So, and I completely enjoyed it. And my biggest memory of that is mowing the lawn in the backyard at home, wearing my little Walkman and playing the Star Trek II soundtrack over and over again as I made the rounds on the lawn. And it's one of my favorite memories from when I was a kid.
Ashley, did you see it in a theater first run, or?
I did, actually, but I almost didn't get to, because the weekend that it was released, I was almost dead, and for a really great reason. I had a thing when I was a kid about reading novelizations of movies, sometimes in lieu of going to the movies, and I read the novelization of Star Trek II before I went to see it. Now, I don't know if you guys,
McIntyre.
Yeah, by Vonda McIntyre. I don't know if you guys have seen the movie or not, but a lot of really big stuff happens. And like, for example, Scotty knows that Dr. McCoy is on the bridge, and that's where he should bring his dying nephew. So that was great. But I got to the big moment in Star Trek II, and I had to tell someone. So I went to see my brother, who was 6 years older than I was, and I said, "My God, in Star Trek II, Spock dies." What? Yeah, and I don't know if I've ever been beaten harder in my life. So yeah, I almost didn't make it to see the film, but it was great.
Well, let's take a quick look at this segment from the documentary about Star Trek II. If we can run the clip.
Roll them.
Let's take a look at the clip. I can act it out. Hey, can we take a look at the clip? Okay, great. Let's do it. Fantastic. Thank you.
Probably in terms of all the films in 1982 that has loomed the largest for me and had the biggest influence on me was Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan.
Logic clearly dictates that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Or the one.
The first Star Trek movie was really confusing and very disappointing, I think, to a lot of people, just because it didn't feel
that view,
like
by
the
way.
show somehow.
The movie, the motion picture, Ultimately, he made money and was successful for them, but at the time, there was a great deal of disappointment because they hoped it would be the same as Star Wars and make billions for the studio, but it didn't.
And then Wrath of Khan comes along, and it just feels like the best episode of Star Trek you've ever seen.
I shall leave you as you left me, as you left her, marooned for all eternity in the center of a dead planet. Buried alive. Buried alive.
When Wrath of Khan came out, it hit all the buttons that I wanted. It had the comedy.
What about my performance? I'm not a drama critic.
It had the cheer moments.
I don't like to lose.
The heart and the emotion.
Don't grieve, Admiral.
That to me was a completely fulfilling Star Trek movie. And I thought, okay, they know how to do it now. They're on the right track.
Thematically, it's really, really sophisticated stuff.
As a matter of cosmic history, it has always been easier to destroy than to create.
Not anymore. Now we can do both at the same time. According to myth, the Earth was created in 6 days. Now watch out. Here comes Genesis. We'll do it for you in 6 minutes.
Most of that, if not all of that, comes from Nick Meyer's relative indifference to Star Trek. I think he was able to step outside of the mystique and tell a story that worked by itself.
As Robert Bresson said, my job is not to find what the public want and give it to them. My job is to make the public want what I want. If I listened to the public, Spock wouldn't have died. I can't second guess millions of people I never met. My assumption is if I like it, other people will like it. The themes of the story began to emerge logically from what I was trying to do.
It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. Message, Spock?
None that I'm conscious of. Except, of course, happy birthday. Surely the best of times.
So this is going to be a story about friendship, old age, and death.
How we deal with death is at least as important as how we deal with life, wouldn't you say?
It dimensionalized Captain Kirk in a way we hadn't seen. He had a family, he had a son, and it hurts him.
I did what you wanted. I stayed away. Why didn't you tell me?
How can you ask that?
That, to me, dimensionalizes this sort of heroic character.
When they decided to make another movie, I heaved a sigh of relief. I loved doing Star Trek. Captain Kirk was a really interesting character, complex as the writers could make it. And there were times it was very complex, and other times it was very simplistic, kiss the girl and beat the villain up, which was good fun.
I have to say, he was a great hero character, and he played it in such an iconic way. Sometimes that's why you can't escape the characters once you play them. They're so iconic. When you look back, he was great.
There's a man out there I haven't seen in 15 years. Who's trying to kill me. You show me a son, I'd be happy to help him.
When we were involved in casting, or asking our key people to come back, primarily, Leonard was problematic. He did not want to come back. His words, and he did say this, I don't want to put on the ears again. He wanted to move on to other things.
He was a smart guy. He said, well, all right, if I come back, I want to direct the next one. And that's what he did. He negotiated from a position of strength to do Star Trek 3.
While we were trying to convince Leonard, Sam People was one of the writers. He was the writer working on the draft at that time. This is pre-Nick. He said, why don't we kill Spock off? And that set me back in my chair. We realized the dramatic potential of that. We'd have an intensely emotional, it's years now where we have this character and we're going to kill him. Plus the fact that it makes Leonard happy. Went to him, explained what we were going to do, and he came on board. That was also colored by the fact that word got out that we were going to kill Spock.
There are a lot of theories about how Spock's death got out, but almost all rumors lead back to Star Trek's creator, Gene Roddenberry, who denied it up and down.
We all know that that's who it was.
There was some evidence that he let it slip to a few key people, and it began a letter-writing campaign.
The proverbial cat is not only out of the bag, but bouncing off the walls, because the fans went crazy.
It was on the Wall Street Journal at one point.
One day, I came home from work, and on my telephone answering machine was a message, a voice I did not recognize, deep. It said, you kill Spock, we kill you. And I looked at that, I said, I think these people are taking this a bit too seriously.
Anyway, so that's a brief snippet of the Star Trek 2 segment, which was much longer. But, you know, beyond the classics we remember, I mean, there's also stuff like The Sword and the Sorcerer and Friday the 13th Part 3 in 3D and Halloween 3 Season of the Witch. I mean, it's a remarkably diverse year of films. Do you have, like, what's your favorite film from that year? Do you have a favorite?
Oh, yeah, easily. I mean, if you set aside Star Trek II, I think in retrospect, my favorite film of that year was E.T. I think obviously it's a classic. I personally think it's Spielberg's masterpiece, and I mean that in the classic sense, that it's the movie that demonstrated that it wasn't a lucky coincidence that he did Jaws and Close Encounters, that in fact he was and Raiders, thank you, that he was in fact a master of the form, because E.T. was so different from those other films, and it just spoke to me in a different way.
Would it be, putting Star Trek II aside?
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite?
And E.T.
And E.T., okay.
I really enjoyed Tron when I first saw it. That again was something completely different. It was a different looking movie. It felt different. It felt like a cartoon, but for adults, because the story had a lot of sort of deeper meanings to it, and I liked the sort of religious allegory that was being told, and that it was a gladiator movie in sci-fi. And it was a lot of fun, and I really enjoyed it. When I first saw it, it was surprising to me how much I liked it.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because it wasn't just great groundbreaking movies like Blade Runner, which showed us the future, which pioneered visual effects, which showed us the future of cinema. There were also these big swings and misses. And for anybody who was reading comic books at the time, you couldn't have missed the ads for Megaforce. With our good friend in the hall, Barry Bostwick, we love him. And this is a film that is remarkable for its inanity, how bad it is. It's directed by Hal Needham, who made his bones as a stuntman. And this was going to be a
great stuntman, by the way.
A great stuntman.
So you're naming him the fall guy for this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And this was going to be the next big franchise. Mattel put a bunch of money into it. And 20th Century Fox was already planning sequels. And if you were alive at the time and reading Starlog, you're like, this is going to be the greatest movie ever.
The Megaforce cinematic universe.
And
that's right.
What's remarkable is the weekend it came out, it was the most successful film of that weekend, and it was a bomb. You know what the other two movies were? Blade Runner and John Carpenter's The Thing. Two of them are classics. And Megaforce, as I think I say in the film, is a genuine anti-classic. So whether you love it, have never heard of it, or don't appreciate its charms, let's take a look at Megaforce.
Are you man enough for Megaforce? The audience basically was 12-year-old boys. The 12-year-old boy would be brought to the theater by their dad, and they would bond over this movie. Then they would go home, and then they would put rockets on their Schwinn bikes and do everything to make it look like a Megaforce motorcycle. It was so simple. It was good guys against the bad guys. It was black and white.
Leaders of every free nation in the world secretly contribute their best men and their most advanced equipment, and they determine where and when we strike.
I remember Megaforce had this great ad that every Marvel comic published around that time. They had, deeds not words, Barry Bostwick's character. It wasn't a photograph. It was a comic book style recreation. So you really did feel like, oh my God, this movie's like a comic book come to life. And, 12-year-old boy, there's nothing cooler than that.
The hardest part of making Megaforce was the thought that I could be killed at any moment by a vehicle which would go out of control, or a rocket which would basically go 20 feet, turn around, and go right through my chest.
We have a little problem here.
Those rockets, you lit them and they just took off and you didn't know where they were going to go. They go off and then they just spiral all over the place. They were like boys playing with fireworks.
That's the way it is.
I was stoned by the pool and they came and they said, no, you'll have to shoot this afternoon. And I go, well, I thought I was off for the day, or else I wouldn't have gotten, stoned by the pool in Las Vegas. And then I would be rushed to the set and hope that they didn't put me on a motorcycle that day. There was never any question that all the hardware and all the stunts wouldn't dominate the film. What was not thought through, I think, was the actual lines that came out of our mouths. A lot of these lines were made up on the spot.
But the good guys always win, even in the 80s.
I'm going to take credit for everything that's funny in the movie, and I'm not going to take credit for all the crap.
Megaforce, you could joke around, but like everything in there, there's no CGI. That's all real. Everything was practical. A lot of money and time went into building all the vehicles. This is Michael Bay level of stuff, before Michael Bay.
I'm proud of what it is, but my work in it is just terrible.
I have an apology to make.
The good guys always win, even in the 80s. That acting was as bad as my acting in the movie.
I think that's the best argument for CGI that has ever been made.
Were you a Megaforce fan? Had you even seen Megaforce?
Not a bit. I saw it. I totally did. Or I might have been a potential fan of Megaforce. But no, I saw it and I went, what is going on? Because it is a mess. But it's an entertaining mess to just imagine why the heck anyone would have done this.
You saw it for Persis Kambata, though. You were a big fan.
Well, yeah, of course. I mean, Persis Kambata looking luminous in Megaforce and not really knowing what she was doing in it. And the audience, both. The audience didn't know either. But, the magic of Hal Needham lives on.
Yeah. But for you, I imagine the film that came out that weekend that looms the largest is one of your favorite movies of all time, of course, is John Carpenter's The Thing.
Yeah, absolutely. That movie, first of all, still holds up, number one. Number two, I think what works best about it is that John Carpenter really found a formula that in a way varied a lot from his usual shtick, right? Which was a little bit off-center and different. I mean, you see his command of claustrophobia and kind of the idea of the monster in the house and in Halloween, which was pretty groundbreaking, obviously, in its own way. But you really feel this sense of isolation in The Thing. And you really understand who all of these characters are as you're watching them get taken out one by one, and the paranoia, and it's terrific, it's scary, it has one of the best film endings of all time. It ends on a question mark, which really you should never do unless it's a great question, but it is. In fact, when my son, my oldest, was about 7 years old, we went to see E.T. at the Egyptian Theater in LA, and after E.T., they were going to show The Thing. And I'm sitting there with my 7-year-old, and I'm thinking, if I sit here and I watch The Thing with him as well, am I the worst father of all time or the best? We went home.
I don't know if you'd make the same decision now, would you?
No, I wouldn't. We would absolutely stay.
Yeah. So many great comedies, Darren. Tootsie, yes. 48 Hours,
Blade Runner,
Diner, My Favorite Year. Do you have a favorite comedy of 1982?
I really enjoy My Favorite Year. Peter O'Toole is great, playing this sort of Errol Flynn type character, but a little less drunk than the real one.
Little.
Very little. But it's such an interesting sort of take on early television and the showbiz that no one really thought about then. Sort of doing live TV, and it brings up all sorts of questions about how they made things work back then, and it's a fascinating character piece. About this, and it's very exciting and fun to watch.
It's a remarkable year for Sylvester Stallone because not only does he have Rocky III, he has First Blood come out that year. And, whatever you think of the Rambo movies, First Blood is a real movie.
Yeah.
First Blood's great.
It's the serious version of Rambo.
Yeah. It was a real drama that in its later iterations became a parody of itself and kind of cashing in, I think, on what people believed was great about that movie, but it wasn't. What was great about First Blood was that, John Rambo was a real person who was capable of incredibly dangerous things. And the fact that we found ourselves cheering for him, right? He was like this enormously successful anti-hero, but not in a Dirty Harry kind of way.
Right. Well, what's so interesting about that movie, too, is in the original cut, like in the book that it's based on, Rambo dies. And they realized that that was a bit of a downer of an ending. They reshot,
Yeah, so when they landed his torpedo on the Genesis planet, that was pretty great.
But you think that franchise wouldn't exist if they hadn't have rewritten and reshot the ending in which Rambo lives. And it was a really obviously great choice in retrospect. And it's just an incredible year for him. I mean, a couple of actors had multiple movies come out that year that were super successful, but nobody had, more success than Sylvester Stallone. I mean, and also Kirk Douglas was supposed to play Troutman in First Blood. And what happened is once Sylvester Stallone comes on board, he keeps rewriting the script to make Rambo more and more important, and Troutman starts becoming this big role that's smaller and smaller and smaller. So when Kirk Douglas shows up, he's literally on location and sees the role that he now has, which has been truncated. He gets in the van and goes to the airport and goes home. And they had to cast Richard Crenna on incredibly short notice for that role, and he's great in it. So it's one of those Hollywood stories that you just never know. I mean, sometimes necessity is truly the mother of invention. Why do you think that year is so groundbreaking in so many ways? We hadn't seen, whatever you think of Tron, or Dark Crystal, a movie entirely made with puppets.
Mm-hmm. Not made by puppets, but with puppets.
Or Star Trek II, which is as different from Star Trek the Motion Picture as you could possibly imagine, whether for good or for ill.
Yeah.
It's Poltergeist, which inverts the old dark house paradigm and sets a horror movie in a contemporary suburban housing development with kids who have Darth Vader posters on the wall.
Swimming pool.
So why do you think 82 was like this milestone year in which cinema really was transformed?
I think it has to do with the slow reaction of Hollywood to the success of Star Wars. Star Wars came out in mid-1977, and it took Hollywood completely by surprise. They weren't expecting anything like that. 6 months later, Close Encounters comes out, and they're going, what are we doing? We got to be doing some big populist movies like this. And the process of development for Hollywood in that time was 3 or 4 years sometimes. Yeah. And so it's this lag that sort of gave us all the magical sci-fi fantasy genre movies in 82, because it's really amazing the number of them that came out that year, and how many of them are even remembered now. It's quite extraordinary, and it never happened again.
Yeah. Well, do you think that?
I think that's totally true. It's just, William Goldman said. Is it William Goldman who said nobody knows anything? Yeah. I don't even know who said it. And I think he's right. You look at the success of Star Wars, you look at the success of Jaws, and suddenly you have this thing that Hollywood never had before. You had the blockbuster. Hollywood only had one way to make movies, right? Which is the same way that they had been making movies that produced Jaws and Star Wars, except now they had this notion, as Darren said, that that there is this way to hit the sweet spot. So I think by the time you hit 1982, everybody embraced nobody knows anything. And they let filmmakers go and try whatever it was to try to recreate that success because nobody understood the formula yet. and sequels weren't really a thing yet. None of that stuff like that we now look at as, hey, well, now we're on the 29th movie in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. We don't think about that. Nobody asked, like, well, why is there a Star Trek 2? You know, it was, or why is there an Empire Strikes Back? We knew. And I think that the 80s were really just this incredible time of experimentation that were the product of success in the 70s.
And it was right at the moment that corporate America started taking over the movie business. And at that point, they didn't think that they knew everything about how to make movies, so they let the creative people do it. Later, they realized it was all them all the time, and so they made the decisions. But it was a very short window where the creative people could actually do movies that they thought would do well.
Well, there's also something very transformative going on as well, which is it's the emergence of, even though HBO had been around, HBO becomes really big as a way for people to re-experience movies, and home video is really taking off. It's the first year where videotapes are released on home video for an affordable price. At the time, Star Trek II and Officer and Gentleman are the first movies to be released at $39.95, which was remarkably cheap compared to the rental business, where if you wanted to buy a tape, it was over $100 if you could even buy it. So now people are starting to re-experience movies over and over again, and that's why you get, a lot of people didn't know HBO stood for home box office. They thought it stood for, hey, Beastmaster's on, because Beastmaster was on every 12 minutes on HBO. And that was another 1982 movie that was, huge, and that home video and television and repeats really made into a mainstay. And you saw that because the TPS was also the Beastmaster station. The Beastmaster was their second most successful movie ever, next to Gone with the Wind, which is crazy because a lot of people don't even remember Beastmaster. But that was another film in 1982.
I guarantee there were no ferrets in Gone with the Wind.
And this was also a time, because this is still when you saw re-releases. So one of the most successful movies of 1982 is a movie that came out in 1977. Star Wars was in the top 10 because it was the re-release of Star Wars, because most people couldn't watch it at home yet. And you still had this huge popularity of the toys. And I want to look at one of those commercials because they're just hysterical. Some is hysterical. So.
Long ago, in a galaxy far away, the Star Wars saga began, and Kenner continues the excitement.
We must capture Luke Skywalker.
Zuckuss, Imperial TIE Fighter pilot, AT-AT Commander, and Hoth Luke Skywalker, each sold separately.
Those guys don't give up.
Which way now, AT-AT Commander?
He must be in here. We've got you now, Skywalker. Shoes on the other foot. I've got you.
Zuckuss, AT-AT Commander, and other action figures each sold separately from Kenner's Star Wars Return of the Jedi collection.
What's amazing is that's better than an episode of the Book of Boba Fett.
Wow.
He's not wrong.
He's not wrong.
Thank you, Patty. I like candy. But it's really, so it's an incredible year. So you see the best of the 70s are still, because Raiders got re-released that year, Star Wars got re-released that year. In fact, I think 82 was the first year that Star Wars had Episode 4, New Hope on it. And people went just to see the crawl change. I know I was one of the idiots. I got to go see it again. They changed the crawl.
And now if you call it A New Hope, we kick you out of the room.
I think that was before that, because Empire came out in 80.
But A New Hope wasn't until after Empire. They didn't release it. Because remember the print we saw at the Cinematheque?
Right.
That was the 82 print. That was the first print that had Episode 4 on it.
Someone will check on us.
Okay, I'm sure they
have a research department called the Internet.
That's right. But I'd love also to hear maybe what you guys' favorite movies of 82, because maybe there's some we're not talking about. I don't think anybody, Meryl Streep in what was it, Still the Night is going to be on your list. But maybe Albert Finney and Peter Weller in Shoot the Moon. We got a...
In April, Star Wars was re-released with the additional Episode 4 and A New Hope in 1981.
1981. Okay, so Darren's right. So 81 was when Star Wars was re-released with The Crawl, but then it came out again in '82 and was one of the top movies of the year, which is crazy.
This is why they put me in the middle.
You're the middleman.
I'm the middleman. There's fights, I just go.
But yeah, I'd love to hear you favorite movies from '82, because it's just you keep going. You say, oh, that was '82. You know, Paul Schrader's remake of Cat People, and it's interesting because you see the same way that now, you know, Kevin Feige will talk about a movie he grew up on, or a lot of filmmakers talking about these films that were huge influences for them from the 80s and 90s. Back then, it was all people talking about these movies they grew up in the 50s. So you had Paul Schrader remaking Cat People. You had John Carpenter remaking The Thing from Another World. You know, Spielberg wasn't strictly remaking anything, but he was kind of honoring those films that he saw as a kid. Sub-Commander Tal.
Well, I want to shout out, you've already mentioned it, but Conan the Barbarian.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of people hear that name and they kind of vaguely remember it as sort of a, beefcake, ridiculous fantasy movie from back then. But that movie, cinematography is beautiful.
Gorgeous.
John Milius does such an amazing job. And Arnold Schwarzenegger, he barely speaks in that movie, which is a good thing in some ways. But the first 5 or 10 minutes of it's like a tone bone.
Yeah. Well, it's so funny you say that because Conan is a gorgeous movie shot in Spain with an amazing score by Basil Polidoris. And we give it a lot of love in the documentary, I'll tell you that. But it's interesting because Dino De Laurentiis, who was this big, larger-than-life Italian producer, you know, he talked with an accent, he could not really speak English. And so when they went to Dino and said, we want to cast Arnold Schwarzenegger in the film as Conan, he goes, no, he has an accent, I don't want to use him, he's terrible. And
exactly like that, by the way.
So John Milius says, well, then I got the perfect person. I got an Oscar winner. He's a big box office draw. And he says, oh, this sounds great. Who? He goes, Dustin Hoffman. And then he goes, fine, cast Arnold. I don't care. But it's interesting because that was another one that had real ratings board problems because of the blood. You know, the orgy chamber was not an issue, but the blood was a problem, and they had to really cut that and change it.
In fairness, there is that whole scene where they've got the big vats like full of soup that are basically made out of
green soup with people
parts in it. Yeah, and that's built.
People.
That's a little intense.
Soylent Green soup.
That's right. It's made of people.
Yeah. So my question, and this is interesting because we had this guy Merv Block on the Treksperts, thanks to Darren, on our podcast. And Merv talked about recording the Orson Welles trailer for Star Trek: The Motion Picture. But he had also done, 2 years later, worked with Orson on Conan. And so in the documentary, he talks about working with Orson Welles. And we have the original recordings of that trailer, which is remarkable because, of course, he's miserable. He doesn't want to do it. And he basically says, and then when at the end it says, rated R, not admitted without a parent, he refuses to say that. He says, it sounds like some kind of low-rent announcer.
It sounds like a used car commercial.
Like a used car commercial. And he wouldn't say it. They're arguing. He's getting drunker and drunker the whole time. But meanwhile, he says, so what don't you want to say? Rated R, not admitted without a parent. He says, oh, okay, well, let's record the rest. And he says, yeah, you get some low-class announcer. I'm not doing that. It breaks the spell. So, of course, they used the version where he says, what do you want me not to say? But it's wild. And that's a film, I think that, God bless Sarah, who's wonderful in Conan the Destroyer, but that's a terrible movie compared to the original Conan, which is very serious and Nietzschean, and John Milius was not a big fantasy fan, but he loved opera. He loved larger than life, and you see it in that movie, and that's another movie that really stands the test of time.
And he wanted to make it a historical document.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Of a time that didn't exist.
I consider it the yin to Conan's yang, and I don't know. I missed the beginning, so I missed it. But
I don't think you can say Conan's yang.
Right,
absolutely not, sir.
Well,
not
I think Sword and the Sorcerer does it for me.
Yeah, and it's funny we did absolutely.
Yeah, it's wonderful. It's soupy, and again, it's got that surreptitious underground sort of attitude to it. And yeah,
They made it for $1.
Yeah, exactly.
But
And it
here's-
made 80 million, which is why they didn't do the sequel, because it was private investors in Europe, and they said, you know what, we've made so much, we're done.
Yeah,
It
we're good.
made
Thanks.
more money than Conan.
Yes.
Conan cost $40 million and basically turned a small profit. Sword and Sorcerer cost like $1 and made more money than Conan. It made $80. It's insane. But that was when you could make a movie for $1 million and release it in theaters and have it play for months, if not years, and be wildly successful. I mean, Corman made a business out of it. And that year he had Forbidden World, which is so funny because Forbidden World started off with basically coming off of Battle Beyond the Stars and Galaxy of Terror. And Roger Corman tells his editor, Alan Holtzman, he says, I want you to rip off Lawrence of Arabia and put it into space. But as soon as they realized that Lawrence of Arabia in space was too expensive, he said, forget that. Just rip off Alien again. And that's what they did. They ripped off Alien, and it became Forbidden World, which is also known as Mutant, which is an interesting little horror picture.
You guys talk about Tron? 'Cause that was a classic for that year as well.
Have you even seen it?
You talked a little bit about Tron before, but Tron is remarkable because you got to remember Disney was not the Disney of Marvel. Thanks, Patty. Was not the Marvel juggernaut. This was when they would be re-releasing animated films, and they put out like crap like Condor Man. No offense, and so. Tron was like their big gamble. Like Ron Miller thought this was going to be the thing that saves the studio. This is transformative. This is the kind of risk that Disney took, in the early days. And it wasn't because it was really ahead of its time.
The people who made it, and the technicians who oversaw it, like Harrison Ellenshaw, who was head of the Matte department at Disney. They were trying to figure out every possible way to make this film. They were originally going to make it all animated. And they had done a lot of experiments with sort of backlit graphic animation. And because Steve Lisberger had an animation company that sort of specialized in doing that, like blurbs for radio stations and things like that. And they had developed this character called Tron, which is just this sort of big, sort of computer-like character that had a disc that he threw around, and it made big sparkly things on the screen. And so they finally got around to sort of coming up with a script for this about going into the computer world. And luckily, they discovered that there were some very early computer graphics companies who were experimenting with this kind of thing, and they could barely do it because there was no really good way of transferring digital images to film. They basically were filming a CRT tube, and it hadn't been done before. And as you see in the film, there's a lot of sequences that should have been done CG that they just reverted to regular animation, like the grid bugs and things like that. What are they doing there? I don't know. We just had to fill the time. But it's really amazing because several companies sort of chimed in to do sections of the film. But the main interesting thing was that it was a tour de force in regular optical printing filmmaking because they isolated all the live action and hand drew rotoscoping to isolate colors and isolate what would glow and all that. And that it was an incredibly tough job to do. They had companies in, I think, Korea doing it at the time. And it's just an incredible task to make even the non-CG stuff in the film work. And technically, it is unmatched for the time. Story-wise, it's cute. And, Jeff Bridges is amazing, as always. But it's such a, like I said before, you originally think of it as like a kid's movie, but there are other layers under there that the older you get, the more you can appreciate them.
So, it's interesting, too, about Tron, because much like today, they were looking for a star to hedge their bets. We need a star. and everyone turned him down because it was like, what is this movie about? Well, it's about these people that live inside your computer that are basically Spartacus inside your VIC-20, your Commodore 64. And they're users, and there's the game grid, and it's like, what? No, nobody's doing that movie. But Jeff Bridges, because he's crazy
and super far
out, man. Far out, man. I want to do that movie. So, and that's how Jeff Bridges ended up doing it. To this day, he's super proud of it because it's a great movie. And it was totally ahead of its time. And it was a huge bomb. But what's funny is they made a lot of money on the video game because the video game in arcades was hugely popular. And that helped to defray some of the losses. And of course, it's kept its reputation alive. So you had many years later the sequel, and now they're
there's a sequel to the sequel.
Do Tron 3, which is a long time coming, and hopefully they'll get it right this time. So
third time's the charm.
Third time's the charm. So now here's a question for you: in the year in which Blade Runner came out, E.T., Star Trek II, The Verdict, Diner, all these fantastic, my favorite year, all these fantastic movies. What do you think won the Oscar that year? Well, I'm glad you mentioned Fast Times because we didn't talk about Fast Times. That's another, Fast Times at Richmond High came out that year. Porky's came out that year. And you can't imagine two movies being more opposite because you call them both teensploitation, but Fast Times is a very smart, intelligent movie, based on Cameron Crowe's book about going back to high school and writing about what high school was like in the 80s, pretending he was a high school student, repeating the grades that his mother made him skip. So it's a great, it's a great movie. And Universal was embarrassed. There were executives there who said, we can't release this. It's going to bring down the studio. It's just pornographic. And it was, of course it's not. It's a very smart, nuanced movie with, Sean Penn and Judge Reinhold and Phoebe Cates. And it's phenomenal.
Phoebe Cates was in that movie?
Did I see that?
Yeah, well, she was. Phoebe Cates was
parts of her.
It's just a great, movie. Then you have something like Porky's, which basically made a fortune off of the one sheet,
Right.
And
Mole. Sorry, if you've seen the movie, you know what I'm talking about.
But no, it didn't win. That didn't win the Oscar. Gandhi won, which is crazy because it's exactly the kind of movie you expect to win an Oscar.
And it did.
Talk about a movie that doesn't stand the test of time. No one talks about Gandhi now. If anything, they say, Ben Kingsley playing an Indian? But...
Did he win the Best Actor for that?
He did. He won the Best Actor for that as well. So E.T. won a bunch of technical categories.
Ben Kingsley played Indira Gandhi?
It's really... it's amazing to see what stands the test of time. And that's why, the Oscars, as we know, is not necessarily indicative of what will be... the classics in the year to come. But I'm so glad you mentioned Fast Times. So the other movies from '82. Well, we talked about Beastmaster. But absolutely, Beastmaster's great. Don Coscarelli, and that was interesting because they optioned an Andre Norton novel, and they read it, and like a lot of people adapting material today, said the title's great. They basically threw out the entire book and said, we're going to call it the Beastmaster, because the Beastmaster doesn't even take place on Earth. And they licensed, for $10,000, they got these oil fields up in Simi Valley to shoot. And they made that for $4 or $5 million, and it's really amazing what they pulled off.
And also Beastmaster has two ferret friends named Momo and Popo, and so evidently he's 5 years old, which is great. I aspire to that myself.
But
someday
they had a tiger that they had to put Lady Clairol on to make a black tiger because it was not a black tiger. And and Mark, it's so funny. They would tell Mark Singer, you got to be really careful because the tiger doesn't know they're in a movie and doesn't want to be in a movie. And Mark Singer would be like, no, he's my friend.
I was told it's a documentary.
And it's like that's what Siegfried and Roy said too.
Yeah.
But
all you can eat, all you can imagine.
But he.
What do you guys think of The Dark Crystal? That's one of my favorite Jim Henson movies.
You love Dark Crystal, yeah. I think Dark Crystal, I have so much respect for it.
Right.
Yeah. I don't know if I say I love it, but I respect it because I think what Jim Henson accomplishes is amazing. And not only that, it tested really badly because originally it was subtitled in another language. They all spoke in another language. And then they dubbed it in English later on when they realized it wasn't working. And what Henson did was he took all his his money that he had made and bought it back. Oh, wow. He bought it back from Lou Grade, who financed it, so he could do what he wanted with it, because he believed in it. And I love that. And then Universal released it, and it did okay.
Yeah, again, it's technically amazing. I think that the world that Brian Froud created with his designs is fascinating. I don't think it translates into 3D, though. I don't think it translates off the flat page. It's extremely odd. I think one of the things that bothers me about it is the gelflings, the human-like puppets, that there is sort of no touchstone that humans have in this world. And it would seem to me that if they had found a way to do it with actual humans in just those roles, then it might have been an interesting sort of combination of styles going on. It's a little overwhelming for me, just because the story is so incredibly simple yet so hard to understand. But it's fascinating. It looks beautiful, and again, the determination that Henson had to make that, which is one of his dream projects, and he was able to see it through, is truly an amazing story.
It's a movie to be, I think, admired and respected. I don't know that I love it, but I find it very watchable. But I think my issue with the Gelflings was, one of my issues with the kind of the voice performances throughout was that they were just so, the voice performances felt disconnected from what was happening on the screen, like from the action. I don't mean like the sync.
Because they had to create the dialogue to sync
sure.
with the mouths, because the mouths had originally said something completely different. Yeah.
No, sure. But I also mean just I don't know that the voice direction in that movie was great. Because there was nothing in what was happening. Those performances kind of hold me into it, and I think that made the Gelflings twice as creepy.
I love the Trevor Jones score.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think it also has a really interesting message, because at the end, without giving anything away, we kind of find out what unites the two species.
They're all puppets,
and and it's a nice message. But it was a huge risk for Henson that ended up paying off, because he not only bought back Dark Crystal, but bought back the Muppet Show. And then many years later, he was able to sell them all to Disney for a ton of money. So it was a good investment.
After he died.
For him. Yeah. Well, that's true. Yep. Oh, that's good. That's a good, people don't mention that. Yeah, and that's a 1982 movie, Death Trap, and it was based on the play. And it's a wonderful movie. I think Warner Archives put it out a couple years ago on Blu-ray. And people don't talk about it. I don't think we even mention it in the documentary. Like, there are a lot of things I would have loved to include, like Pink Floyd The Wall. People don't talk about that anymore. That's 1982, right? I'm not talking about the album, the movie, the Alan Parker movie. And Alan Parker was a good year. He had Shoot the Moon and Pink Floyd The Wall. Diva was this huge, brought people who never went to go see a foreign subtitle movie into theaters, because it was like basically John Wick in France, but, in French. And people
Which is a Royale with cheese.
And then and then you had like little indie movies like Smithereens that were really big, and Chan is Missing, Wayne Wang's first movie, which is a terrific little detective thriller. So it's like all these kind of interesting movies, and then these big movies, and we barely even talked about Blade Runner. Yeah. There you go, Officer and Gentleman. People forget. Yep. More successful in Star Trek II. We still, obviously we're at a sci-fi convention, but we talk about Star Trek II incessantly. People don't really talk about Officer and Gentleman. That was one of the biggest movies of '82, and hugely successful. And it made, Richard Gere's, career, and, Deborah Winger, who was in demand, but then she got this reputation of being difficult. But a fabulous movie. Absolutely fabulous movie.
But it lifted them up where they belong.
Well, and it's funny because that's where you see the influence of MTV, which launched in '81, where all of a sudden these songs attached to a movie could make or break a movie, because it was the year of Officer and Gentleman and the music video for Up Where We Belong, but it was Eye of the Tiger. Who would have bought a Survivor album if it hadn't been for Rocky III and Eye of the Tiger, which was everywhere.
Survivor's mom would have
singing
bought their album.
Survivor's mom was singing Eye of the Tiger. So all of a sudden and Jesse's Girl from Fast Times. So all of a sudden you had all these songs that were like sort of selling movies because of MTV. And that had never happened before. And those were the worst music videos because it was always just the band sitting there and then there were clips of the movie. There was like no cool music video. It wasn't like Prince or Duran Duran or something.
I felt like the worst music video during the 80s was the duet done with Mick Jagger and David Bowie where they remade Dancing in the Street.
Oh yeah. That's pretty terrible. I would agree with you. Secret of Nim. Yep.
Yeah. Based on a totally terrific book, Mrs. Frisbee and the
Don Bluth.
Yeah.
Who was a former Disney employee and got unceremoniously canned and came back with his revenge by starting a animation company, I think in Ireland, and did some amazing work. Did some beautiful animation in that film.
Yeah, and he had the dual success of Secrets of Nim, where he was a genuine competitor for Disney for a little while, and then he had that great arcade game. What was it?
Dragon's
Lair. Yeah, which was
and then Space Ace.
Yeah, which had their own Saturday morning cartoon spin-offs.
But Don Bluth, long before DreamWorks was a glimmer in their creator's eye, Don Bluth was the Disney competitor. I mean, Secret of Nim is so lovingly animated, and a great Jerry Goldsmith score as well. Mm-hmm. So that's the great 1982. Yep. Yeah,
yes.
No, absolutely. And Creepshow is prominently in the documentary. In fact, we have a whole run with Adrienne Barbeau. We talk about Creepshow, and obviously we talk about Swamp Thing, which is like when anyone can get the license to a superhero. It's amazing. Now we have these empires built around Marvel and built around DC, and what's James Gunn going to do, and release the Snyder Cut. Then it was like, we're going to put out this little crappy Swamp Thing movie that we made for Avco Embassy, which was barely a studio. And
I still like it too. I'm with you.
So that's a fun part of the documentary because that it's Beauty and the Beast, and Adrienne Barbeau is wonderful in it, and Dick Durock, who played the Swamp Thing after he's Louis.
And Creepshow is good too.
Yeah.
And Creepshow,
you can't kill us because we're already dead.
Because again, we talk about people paying homage to what they grew up on. That's George Romero paying homage to the EC Comics he grew up with. And it's super fun. I mean,
no, it's amazing, and it's one of the things that's unique about it, other than the fact that it's bananas, is it's that anthology feel that it is. I think in many ways, Creepshow is the movie that the Twilight Zone movie kind of wanted to be, and maybe should have been, but wasn't. That it really captured the feel of those EC Comics. And those stories are just, you remember some of the imagery from them, which I think is an accomplishment in and of itself. So yeah, it's easy to forget. Creepshow is 1982, but Creepshow is still a thing, man. There was it wasn't just a sequel. There was just a show on Shudder, and I think they're just going for like a second season, which was...
Some of the cockroaches are still working in the industry.
In fact, one of of them is my agent.
Craft Services.
It's weird.
But it's so interesting too because you got to remember it was part of Stephen King becoming a brand household name because even though he'd had Carrie as a bestseller, De Palma gets a lot of credit for that, as he should, The Fury. But it's really in the 80s where you see King become like this icon, and Creepshow had a lot to do with it because not only did he write part of it and get credit, but he's in it. He plays Jordy Verrill, which is not one of the better segments, but he's in it.
I was just going to add to Creepshow, when you were still on the subject, was that I saw it, I didn't get to see it in the theater because I was too young, so I saw it on VHS a year later when I was like 7 years old. My dad showed it to me, not knowing it had scary parts, and I ended up having nightmares for days after that. I was like, thanks a lot, Dad.
Your dad didn't know.
But that's the kind of movie, that's a good gateway drug to horror because it's not totally intense horror. It's not like he showed you
The Thing.
Or Texas Chainsaw Massacre. He started you on Creepshow, so that's good. Because then you would have had nightmares for a month instead of a few days. So that's good.
What do you guys, since we're talking about 1982 and the Wrath of Khan, what do you guys think of the Wrath of Khan from 1982 as opposed to J.J. Abrams' remake with Benedict Cumberbatch?
That didn't come out in 1982.
Star Trek guys, I just curious on your opinion, one versus the other.
My mom always said, if you can't say something nice,
you're probably at the Ice Capades.
Right.
Look, I mean, Star Trek II does everything right for the right reasons, and it thrives on restrictions. I mean, it's a movie that only cost, $11-12 million. I mean, they redid the Enterprise bridge to shoot the Reliant. I mean, they didn't have a lot of money. It was produced by the TV division for features, and yet that's the movie we continue to talk about. Into Darkness had the opposite of that. It had all the money in the world, and it didn't have a script. And at the end of the day, you can't. House does not stand without a strong foundation. And I mean, what Nick Meyer did in 10 days, writing that script, 10 days to keep that movie afloat. He had to turn around a script and rewrite the Jack Soward, Sam Peoples draft. It's a miracle what he did. I mean, I think the great 10-day rewrites, you have Nick Meyer rewriting Star Trek II and you rewriting X-Men First Class in 10 days.
Thank you.
That was the other, to me, a miracle.
it took the Starfleet Corps of Engineers 2 years to write the script for Star Trek Into Darkness. It took Nick Meyer 10 days.
But yeah, I mean, there's no comparison because there's no fundamental understanding of what made Star Trek II work. You're just parroting scenes. It's the difference between how Terry Matalas gets why Star Trek works, which is why when they do moments in Picard that honor the movies or Next Generation, they get it, right? He gets it. And
there's no reason Spock needs to shout out Khan. None.
It's not earned. It's not earned. And if it's not Shatner doing it, who wants to see it?
That's right.
So, So anyway, we obviously have strong feelings about it. And for those, I know we didn't introduce ourselves at the top of the panel because we're doing 1982, but of course, we're the Inglorious Treksperts. We have a very popular podcast on Star Trek and Star Trek adjacent subjects. Darren Doctorman, Ashley Miller, myself, Mark A. Altman, which you can listen to wherever you listen to podcasts or trekspertsplus.com. So if you're a Star Trek fan or you're interested in a lot of genre adjacent stuff, you should check it out. And recently we dipped into Space 1999 for reasons unknown, but you can listen to that maybe if you need your Space 1999 fix. And
who doesn't?
The 40th anniversary of V. We just had Ken Johnson on and talked about V. It's 1984, not 1982. I mean 1983, not 1982. But there's some great stories around that as well. And of course, the documentary on 82 will be airing this summer. I can't tell you where and when, but if you follow the social channels, 1982 Movie, Instagram 1982 Movies, they'll be, hopefully, the network's going to be announcing it soon and we can talk about it. And I hope you'll enjoy it because I think it's really special.
Are you all right?
He's all choked up about it, see?
I am, right.
That would be a hell of a climax to the panel, right? One of us drops dead on the stage. It's a mic drop, literally.
My work here is done. There will not be a documentary.
3, 2, Inglorious Treksperts.
But that means we're out of time.
Indeed we are. And I want to thank you for coming because GalaxyCon has just been terrific. And I think that everyone who works here genuinely cares about the genre and the fans and genre history. And
I mean, they're trying to kill you.
I'm not getting verklempt. I'm actually just choking. But we're very appreciative for them having us, and this has been a great weekend. And thank you, Richmond.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, guys.